In August of this year, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced that women would be able to freely travel without the permission of a male guardian or their husband. That is, they could seek to gain a passport without their permission. I'm going to be looking at three sources today that discuss this international law issue. Firstly, an online news report by the BBC. Secondly, an online news report by the Saudi Gazette. And finally, a televised news report by French television network France 24/7. I'm going to begin by discussing the historical and social context to these legal reforms, and then I'm going to be looking at the three sources and engaging in a comparative analysis of them. So, to put things into context, Saudi Arabia has been consistently criticised in the international arena for its poor human rights record. Torture is still used as punishment in Saudi Arabia, and laws criminalising protest and activism severely restrict freedom of speech. Saudi Arabia is also a country in which women are subject to constant discrimination, as Sharia law effectively enshrines their inequality. Now, this has been subject to some sort of shift since the death of King Abdullah bin Aziz and his succession by Crown Prince Salman, who has been hailed as a progressive leader and has been praised by Western leaders for his reforms in the area of human rights, most notably his lifting the ban on women to drive in 2017. Now, his recent decree allows women to seek a passport without the permission of a male relative, and the three sources that I now look at are analysing those reforms. According to Shoemaker and Rees, framing is a mode of presentation that journalists and other communicators use to present information in a way that resonates with existing underlying schemas among their audiences. And we can definitely see this in the sources I'm about to discuss that are very much shaped by the political attitudes and values of their audiences in relation to women's rights and gender equality. So if we take a look at the first source, which is an online news report from the Saudi Gazette, it's entitled "Saudi Women Regain Their Rights." In the article, they thank Prince Mohammed bin Salman for enabling women to regain their rights and emancipating them from injustice, tyranny and exploitation. They also celebrate the royal decree as putting an end to the machinations of the enemies of progress, who wanted to impose their unfair control on women and society. Now, the language that is used by this article is very final and transformative, and suggests that the recent legal reforms are somewhat of an end to the women's struggle for rights in Saudi Arabia. In effect, it produces these reforms as a solution to the gender equality problem. And this is unsurprising given the political and social context in which Saudi Arabia exists. Like I said before, the law in Saudi Arabia is based in Sharia law, or the Islamic religion, which largely enshrines the inequality of women. And therefore the standard for human rights and gender equality for women is so low in this country that any kind of significant change is perceived as a watershed or monumental moment in the area of women's rights. And we'll contrast this now with the BBC source and the France 24/7 source, which consider this change to be relatively normal and somewhat uncontroversial. The BBC article is entitled "Saudi Arabia Allows Women to Travel Independently." Now, while it celebrates these recent reforms, it also qualifies this celebration by acknowledging that women have and will continue to encounter obstacles to gender equality despite these changes. A large portion of the article is actually dedicated to discussing the restrictions that remain on women's rights in Saudi Arabia, such as requiring permission from a male relative to get married and also not being able to pass along citizenship rights to their children. Similarly, the France 24/7 source acknowledges that Saudi Arabia continues to face international scrutiny over its human rights record. Now, rather than framing these recent legal reforms as a solution to women's problems, both of these articles see the reforms as one step towards gender equality for women in Saudi Arabia. And this is probably influenced by the fact that France and Britain are both relatively human rights compliant countries where women's rights and equality is largely more progressed. Both of these authors come from countries where it's normal for a woman to travel without the permission of their husband, and so they're inevitably going to express less excitement at the recent reforms than the Saudi Gazette. Now, the sources also differ quite a lot in their portrayal of the leadership of Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In the Saudi Gazette article, the prince is thanked for his wise and decisive leadership in relation to the recent reforms. Meanwhile, both the France 24/7 article and the BBC article acknowledge that under his leadership there has been quite a severe crackdown on protests and freedom of speech for women who are advocating in furtherance of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. And this can likely be attributed to the differing political and social contexts of these two regions. In particular, France and Britain are both countries who are a party to the ICCPR, which enshrines human rights such as freedom of expression and freedom of speech, whereas Saudi Arabia is not. So they are more likely to condemn these activities as they are countries who place quite a sense of importance on these human rights. The sources also differ largely in their use of visuals. The news report by France 24/7 depicts various Saudi women going about their daily lives. At one point, it demonstrates a Saudi woman driving. The article by BBC displays images of women fully covered in hijabs walking through an airport, and it also displays an image of a Saudi woman driving. Now, according to Ivor and Oldmeadow, images invoke a more heightened emotional experience than text and are therefore usually more persuasive to a reader. The BBC and France 24/7 sources use visuals to evoke a sense of sympathy from the audience. The depiction of Saudi women going about their everyday lives in a largely oppressive society reminds audiences of their humanness, the fact that they are ordinary people. And it causes the viewer to feel sorry for these women, and in turn causes them to internally condemn the repressive effect of Saudi law on women. That is, of course, assuming that the reader is a feminist themselves. Now, in contrast, the article by the Saudi Gazette contains one image of a Saudi man traditionally clothed. It doesn't seek to appeal to the emotions of its audience, and as it's a Saudi Arabian article, it's probably directed towards the Saudi Arabian community. In 2018, Reporters Without Borders ranked Saudi Arabia as 169th out of 180 countries for freedom of press. It would be not incorrect, therefore, to assume that the government may have at least had some hand or influence in the production of this article. The content of the article also lends support to this inference. It's highly celebratory of the prince and his leadership and attributes him as solely responsible for these most recent legal reforms. Now, unsurprisingly, the Saudi Gazette doesn't draw attention to the nation's poor human rights record or the broader context of inequality in which these legal reforms exist. And combined with its highly celebratory tone, the article is therefore attempting to present Saudi Arabia as a country who is committed to the realisation of women's rights. The Saudi Arabian article also doesn't address how these recent legal changes have been perceived by the Saudi Arabian community or the international community. In contrast, both the BBC article and the France 24/7 report feature positive online reactions from human rights activists and academics. In doing so, these recent reforms demonstrate the anticipation of legal change in Saudi Arabia and how this has long been awaited by the international community and women in that society. The Saudi article doesn't feature such reactions, as this would reflect poorly on the government by highlighting the slow pace at which legal reforms on women's rights are progressing. The three articles demonstrate an inherent conflict that exists in Islamic societies, and that is the conflict between the human right to equality and the human right to freely practice one's religion. Sharia law is grounded in a religion that is premised on the subordination of women. Now, Saudi Arabia's ability to practice gender equality without compromising the freedom to practice one's religion is therefore inherently compromised. Now, the ICCPR, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, provides some basis upon which rights can be reconciled. Article 18.3 says the right to freedom of religion can be limited if it is in pursuit of a legitimate aim. And so the argument could be made that the laws that are being enacted in Saudi Arabia, which pursue women's rights, are in pursuit of a legitimate aim and therefore justify the restriction on the freedom of religion.